Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Agile SAP Change Management. I'm Mark Beebe, Marketing Campaign Manager for Worksoft and your host for today's session. First, a couple of logistical points. We have a large number of people on the call today, so the lines will be muted, but we will take questions toward the end of this 60-minute broadcast. Please use the question feature to submit questions at any time during the webinar. For questions that we can't get to during the Q&A session, we'll be sure to get back to you with an email reply. We will also make a link to the recording of this webinar available for registrants who are unable to make it, or perhaps for colleagues you think might benefit from the material. Let me now introduce our speaker. We are privileged to have Mike Veach with us today. Mike is a solution architect and has been with Worksoft for 2 years. Over the course of his career, Mike has served in a variety of roles, including application development, methodology development, training and education, and account planning and startup. For the past 15 years, Mike has been focused on SAP implementations, leading both strategy and implementation projects. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning, and thank you for taking the time to join us. My name is Mike Veach, and today I'm going to talk about Agile change management in an SAP environment. So some of the things we're going to talk about are how we go about planning and taking Agile into consideration when we're going to do SAP implementations. We'll talk about some of the key considerations specific to SAP and how Agile automation fits in with the concepts of continuous integration, continuous deployment, and continuous testing. We'll also talk about how Worksoft enables automation to improve quality, reduce timelines and risk, and we'll look at a couple of customer case studies. So before I get too far, I'd just like to make a note, right? Agile is a huge topic, so an in-depth discussion of this could bring us here for days, if not weeks. That's not the intent of this session. The idea here is really to provide a high-level perspective on the topic of Agile as it relates to SAP, and specifically how Worksoft fits as a component in that Agile framework. So if you're on this call, I think it's pretty safe to guess that you're somehow affected by a push or a requirement to implement SAP in an Agile manner. I think it's also a safe guess that if you've been given that push, the typical response you've had is, what are you talking about? Agile SAP is an oxymoron. It doesn't work that way. I know that because I've had a lot of recent conversations with customers who've talked about Agile and the need to go for Agile or DevOps with SAP, and the comment frequently is, we don't really know how you can do that. What are your thoughts on that? So that's a very common point, and in fact, in my experience with SAP, it was frequently the case where we felt that Agile wasn't really possible with SAP. The intent here today is to talk about what is possible. When we look at methodologies in SAP, there are a couple of ways of going about it, right? There's waterfall and there's Agile. Each of them has its own risks. Waterfall, right? The risks are that it takes too long, it's too slow to deliver value to the customer. With Agile, the risk is that you may go too fast, that there's too little testing, that there's too high a potential to introduce risk or problems into production, or that you might deliver too little value. So both have their risks. Some companies have tried to take both approaches with it. And if you can see from the quote there from Gartner, their estimation is that by this year, most companies will have made an attempt to implement Agile and or waterfall. Unfortunately, a lot of them will do it the wrong way, and that they'll make a mess of it. And so the intent is really to say, how do we choose the right way to go about implementing SAP, and what's the correct approach to use? So the takeaway, though, from this is that Agile, it is in motion, right? It is becoming a push. The reality is that it can be done, but not in the same sense that it is done in a custom development environment. So SAP is different, enterprise apps are different, and so it requires adaptation to the unique challenges that an SAP presents. Another point is that some of the concepts of Agile have actually been in place in SAP for years, and we'll see some of those as we go through. Another good point is that SAP itself is adopting Agile as the approach to building their own products. And we'll look at how that is affecting not just their product development, but also how it affects their methodologies. Another point of reality is that it is coming, and so we have to get ready for it. Not adopting Agile, it has a cost, right? And that cost can be that you may not be able to move as quickly in adopting SAP technologies and changes to the technologies as rapidly as they're coming out. SAP has very much increased the pace at which they're releasing functionality and applications. Organizations will need to keep up with that. So if we don't adopt some sort of Agile approach, we run the risk of not being able to adapt to changes and take advantage of new functionality. We may also not be able to just keep up with the sheer volume of testing that has to go on. And so we start to get a backlog and not be able to keep up with things. So when we talk about Agile, typically from Worksoft, we've really talked frequently about Agile from the perspective of DevOps, so from a custom development point of view. And for people who are familiar with SAP and haven't done custom dev, that can be a little bit confusing sometimes. I know it was for me. So what I want to do is come at this from an SAP perspective and think about, we all understand how SAP is implemented. So what is different about enterprise applications and Agile or DevOps for enterprise apps than for custom apps? And it's really on really four key factors. One is massive environments. So we're not talking about just a single application focused on a single business function or purpose. We're talking about environments that span across multiple functional areas, multiple organizations, multiple different types of applications in any customer's landscape. So it's a very different level of scale here, and so the potential for it to disrupt is much larger when you're looking at enterprise applications. Secondly, the enterprise applications tend to be more operations focused. So if you look at the custom dev world, looking at that, there's a lot of focus on the CI side of it, right? So the continuous integration. They're very focused on the developer, and you'll see that there are a lot of applications that are centered around developers and aiding developers in getting code built and integrated into a functioning application. For SAP, it's very different, right? We've already been delivered a functioning application by SAP. And so the focus tends to be not so much on the development side and the CI, but really more on the operations side. And here we're really focused on the fact that we've got, again, these large enterprise applications that can affect the business on such a scale that we have to ensure that these applications are functioning properly in operations, and that they have to be integrated, right? Those operations across all the applications, that has to be coordinated. Third is that there are multiple stakeholders in any SAP implementation, and that spans multiple technical organizations, business users, geographical areas. The size and scale of it really is just different. So this is very different from where you have that single purpose application that may be focused on one unit or one specific focus group of users. And the fourth is finally the risk tolerance. Because of the fact that these are applications that are running a business, the ability to impact business negatively if we introduce some sort of failure is very significant. So most organizations have a very low tolerance for risk with enterprise applications. And what that really means is that we have to have a very high focus around testing and ensuring that we are testing the application iteratively, rapidly, to ensure that we don't impact. So in a nutshell, right, what we've got is a difference in size, scope, scale, impact, risk. If you were to make an analogy, it would be similar to saying I want to make a change to a house versus a change to an entire city. Right? They're just very different. One is very focused and limited. The one has a much greater scale of impact that has to be taken into consideration. So that's kind of just a difference there in terms of what's, when we look at DevOps and the major considerations. What I want to do is just take a moment and just do a quick comparison of, what actually occurs during a project. What does a project lifecycle look like when you're doing custom development versus SAP? Right? So Agile came very much out of the custom development world. And if you look at the process for going from requirements to a deployed functioning application, for custom applications, it's different, right? The two look similar in ways, but there are some differences in the details. Looking at custom development on the left, right, we start out with a set of requirements, we do some architecting. A lot of the work is focused around building, right? And that build consists of writing code and unit testing application. You have individual developers doing that. All that has to be brought together and integrated into a functioning application. And that really is where we get to that point of that developer test and deploy. It's at that point that we have a functioning application that can be installed. From there, right then, you do go through and do integration testing. You do have user testing. But a lot of the focus on the custom world is around that initial set of activities up to the deployment, that continuous integration piece. If you compare that to SAP, that really doesn't exist in the SAP world. That delivered application, right, that functioning application has been delivered to us by SAP. And what we're really doing in the SAP world is we're taking that and we're understanding the requirements and coming up with the design, which is more of a fit gap analysis, and taking that and then going into a set of exercises that are around configuration, defining configuration data, master data. There will be some code, right? You're always going to have RISF objects that you create, ABAP coding that has to be done. But that build really consists of building a process that crosses business units and spans functional areas. The really significant pieces in the testing. A lot of organizations think that you may have up to 60% of your project will be in testing. So again, the difference here in the two different life cycles, right? Again, the type of work, coding versus configuration, the scale of the project, the scope of the application functionality, right? With SAP, there's quite a significant foundation that has to be laid in terms of the configuration. Even though SAP has delivered an application, it still has to be configured just in order to have that base that you can run the business on. So, and then next, the minimal unit of functionality to provide business value is much, much larger for SAP than it is for custom development. So when we think about that, they really are quite different in terms of the development approaches. So we have to look at that and think, okay, well then how do we adapt Agile for SAP? And so a couple of points. There are some things that SAP and the industry have borrowed from Agile, but there are certain components that we know really don't fit well in the SAP world. And one is the traditional Agile Scrum. So if you look at the Agile Scrum in custom dev world, it's focused on iterations where you're running sprints every 2 to 4 weeks, focused on a single function. So we have a single function in, do the sprint, and coming out in the deployment, moving to production. In SAP, that's really not workable because that unit of functionality, right, the stories, those functions are much, much larger. And so it's not really something that can be done in that 2 to 4 week time span. The other is that we have to deliver complete business functionality. So it's not as though you can go live with some parts of finance, but not others, right? There are certain key components that absolutely have to be there in order for that functionality to work for the business, right, to actually run the business. So that functionality might span business organizations, and that 2 week sprint just really isn't possible. Another point is that we have to recognize that not all projects are candidates for Agile. And when we look at it, that point that Gartner made about organizations attempting, both methods, if you try to do apply the wrong methodology, you can really create a mess. So there are some cases where you really don't use Agile, right? For example, if you have let's say an international standard for an interface that you have to comply with, it's not exactly something that you're going to necessarily iterate around, right? That requirement is very fixed. That's something that is really much more of a candidate for a direct, straight through one pass kind of waterfall. Also, a legacy system replacement. Think about I'm replacing an existing MRP system. You can't really piecemeal replace that functionality, right? It has to go in one pass. So it tends to be more of a big bang deployment. Now within that, you might iterate, you might have some Agile types of components, but it's not as though you're going to replace that application in a drip by drip manner. So in terms of how this is actually being implemented in the industry, some examples, right? There are some things that are definitely going on in the industry to adapt Agile for SAP. One is the Scaled Agile Framework. So it is an industry framework that extends the Agile Scrum concept. And it's really taken the key points from ERP implementations in SAP and adapted those in. So you'll see things like the addition of that architect for the end-to-end processes, not typically something that you see significantly in custom Agile dev. It also focuses on using building on what has always been there in terms of programs, projects, portfolio management, and release planning in SAP, and really building that into that Agile approach. Another is that cross-application team collaboration. So one of the things that for me was interesting was learning that DevOps was kind of a novel concept for some people in the Agile or in the custom dev world. I have developers who work with operations to move something into production. If you're from the SAP world, that's how we've always done things. You don't think of doing it any differently. You always have basis working with developers to move changes through the environment. So that's taken into consideration here and formalized. It does use a tiered approach, so where it does have that release train, and within that release train you do have the releases that are built on top of those iterations, sprints and waves. But the key difference is that the sprint isn't artificially forced into production. So where in the custom dev world, the purpose of a sprint is to get that functionality into production, SAFe recognizes that really is not necessarily viable in the SAP world. And so instead, functionality is bundled into units. So if we look at that from an SAP perspective, SAP has adopted many of the concepts from SAFe, and you'll see those showing up in Solution Manager 7.2. So what Solution Manager has done with that is it's really taken some of those key points, such as the feedback loops, right? The whole point of Agile being that we want to have the business seeing the application, getting hands-on with the application earlier in the process. So this is really one of the things that SAP is making a move to here is adapting this approach. So then instead of having a requirements session and then 10 months later the business actually finally gets their hands on the application, this is building really on an approach of having those feedback loops. So in Solution Manager 7.2, it's built around the concept of sprints where you're doing show and tell with the business, and then the waves where they actually are able to touch the application. So being able to iterate and release that functionality to the users for hands-on, but then still doing that within the context of a build phase and doing that within a project, and all that ultimately rolling up into the releases in the release train. So it's very much focused on the business outcomes. Another point, just one minor point here, SAP is also working it has integrations with Jira. So if you think about Jira being used in the custom apps world, SAP is also integrating with that for the ability to automatically create and track defects using Jira. So the quote there at the bottom right is from Hasso Plattner. And we wanted to include that because it's an indication that SAP is saying they are adopting this approach themselves for building their applications going forward. And it's really kind of setting the stage across the board. So that's one aspect of how it's being adapted for SAP. Another way is that if you look at the SAP Activate methodology, you'll see these same kinds of concepts appearing as well. So for years, we've known and been familiar with ASAP. With HANA, SAP has now moved to Activate as the methodology. And with this whole approach around S/4HANA and using Activate, it's really building on some concepts that are intended to help facilitate the quick build, delivery, and release of functionality. And they're doing that through SAP best practices, right, for business processes. SAP is very focused on the use of pre-configured solutions using guided configurations. And the Activate methodology itself is intended to facilitate Agile. So if you look at that, specifically in the methodology here, you'll see that when you get to the realize phase, Activate is built in that you're doing iterations through between configuration and walkthroughs with the users. So it's really focused on getting that early hands-on with the users, and then that eventually being deployed in waves as part of an overall program. So it gives a bit of a picture of, you know, some of the things that are going on in terms of the industry, in terms of with SAP, that will facilitate Agile. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't still have some constraints that apply. And I think this, I wanted to put this in here because I want to be realistic about the fact that we can talk about doing Agile, but you still, you know, you still have to put up that big sign that says thinking is required, right? You still have to think about how does this apply in the realities of an SAP implementation. And so when people say, well, you can't do Agile with SAP, I'd like to make sure that we're kind of making a distinction between what are some of those technical constraints between doing that apply doing Agile, and what are some of the non-technical constraints. And so when we look at some of those non-technical constraints, one of the things we know is in any SAP project, you always have to contend with change control board, right? There's a lot of rigor that's placed around moving changes in an SAP environment so that you don't disrupt the business. And a lot of times what happens is we have those CCBs and we schedule and we have to make changes and try to make sure we get them in by the CCB, and if we miss it, whoops, we have to wait to the next one. Same thing with organizational change. There's always a significant amount of organizational change that has to occur. Organizations have to be able to adopt and really be able to integrate the changes into their practice. Well, both of those can be long poles in the tent if you're not careful. And so one of the points is that you can start to look at some of those as being components to be integrated into the overall Agile approach with SAP. So instead of, you know, one thought is instead of having to wait for the change control board, maybe we set up the change control board to meet as the waves are released, instead of the waves having to try to meet the change control board schedule. Same thing with OCM. We recognize there are always things like calendar freezes, right? Month end, quarter end, year end. There are always times in which the business is saying no moves to production. We get it. That obviously conflicts with the concept of doing, you know, 2-week kinds of Agile sprints. That's a constraint that you work within. We also understand there's also regulatory or compliance, right? You have Sarbanes-Oxley procedures that you may have to comply with. You also have some technical constraints too, right? SAP infrastructure and instances being available. Not necessarily as easy to and quick to spin up as maybe a custom dev environment. So just trying to put all that in the context here, right? So we understand there are things going on in the industry, changes in methodologies, adaptations to enable Agile, and we understand that there are constraints that you have to work within. Given all that, right, this is really getting to the point of the fact that you have to adapt your Agile to the realities of SAP. And one of the other points there is that we know that in SAP projects, we tend to see the same challenges again and again. So if you've done multiple SAP projects, one of the things that you know is that you start to see the same sets of challenges consistently from one project to the next, one customer to the next. And they're pretty predictable, right? We get in and we want to start defining what the functionality needs to be, and we go to define processes, and we want to understand what the business does today, and we find out documentation doesn't exist. Or there's no one around who actually knows what the application does, or if they do, they're too busy to actually spend time with the project. These are constraints that really can impact your ability. You might have the best laid plans to do Agile, but you run into these realities of the fact that you don't have access to the business, or the business can't explain exactly what they do, or you can't test because test cases don't exist, or they're not documented. So if we look at some of those, these are the areas where the Worksoft solutions are really intended to focus and help enable you in that journey to Agile. So if we look at, what are the areas that we tend to focus on for Agile change management, right? We're really looking at some of these key challenges around understanding business process. So being able to automate the discovery of business process and using that to generate documentation to very clearly communicate between the business and the technical teams. Another is that we've always, in the past, typically done things in a waterfall fashion, building out documentation, writing test cases. Well, what if we could do a number of these things in parallel? And so that's one of the things that we'll talk about, is how can we do some of these activities in parallel to help shorten shorten time spans, right, and be able to meet tighter time frames and to get more of an Agile approach. And then finally, the run continuously. So how do we test on a regular basis, repeatedly and rapidly? So if I go back and I look at some of those challenges that we had across typical SAP project, I can align Worksoft products to address a number of those. So if we look at Analyze to be able to understand and automate the business process, Certify for being able to generate test automation, Execution Manager for being able to execute lights out and at scale. So we'll go into these in a little bit more detail here. So if we think about that first point of the automated discovery, Worksoft Analyze gives us the ability to discover business process through a couple of mechanisms. We have the ability to use our capture technology. Capture allows us to capture the business user's interaction with the application. You can then visualize that in process diagrams, allows us to do some exploration, get some insight into how users use the system, really do some analysis there. And then from there, we can begin to create documentation. And if we're working in SAP, we can use that with Solution Manager 7.2 to create blueprints or test cases for Certify. We also have another capability, which is process mining. And process mining is a zero-touch way of understanding and discovering business processes as they were executed by users by looking at the historical data contained within SAP itself. And we're looking at the modules of SD, MM, and WM there. So if we're using Analyze for that automated business process discovery, what we're able to do is, based on either the discovered processes from process mining or from the captured processes from the business users, we're able to generate diagrams that depict the flow of process through the application. Here we see a sequence of transactions executed in SAP. It allows us to see different variants in the process, gives us a lot of insights into what the users are actually doing and helping us understand requirements. So that's on the automated discovery side. We talk about being able to do things in parallel. We're able to use what we've gathered from Analyze and the information we've captured, and we can then automatically generate process documentation. So when we start talking about, now that we've got that information, what can we start doing in parallel? Now, from that, we're able to generate documentation that's very friendly for both the business user. We have very clear English language descriptions, as well as for the QA analyst, being able to see what is being done in the application. So really eliminates a lot of that, or reduces a lot of the discrepancies between what did you mean, what were you doing, it can really reduce a lot of the iterations that occur in developing test scripts. Again, in parallel, we can also use that same information that we've captured to create automated test cases for Certify that we would then build in Certify. So from Analyze, we're able to generate, without any sort of coding, we're able to generate the test scripts, the test processes in Certify. And if you think about it, this is really a key area here where you get the payoff for Agile, right? Because if you are doing Agile and you're implementing Agile methodology, you've got other tools and technologies that you're using to facilitate Agile, and then you go to manually test that, right? You've just lost a lot of the benefit that you've tried to achieve through going with Agile. So with Certify, we have that ability to do that automated testing and really continue to build on that, shortening those life cycles or the testing cycles in Agile. And then another is that we're able to also use Certify where we can, or use our capture technology to create exploratory tests. So this is something that is very important in terms of the fact that we can, a user can go in and without any sort of specific idea in mind, they can go in and create tests, do some exploration in the application. And from that, what we're able to do is we can actually capture those test steps. We can build out the documentation of what they've done. We can flag things as defects. And from that, we can also take that and build automated tests based on those exploratory activities. We can build those as tests in Certify. Okay, and then the last area we talked about is that run continuously. And think about this, again, what we're really trying to do is focus on the business value, right? All of this is centered around business value. So the intent of Agile being that we want to get business value faster. So if we think about how do we do that from the perspective of an enterprise. So if you look at this, when we think about an enterprise, right, SAP is one of the applications that they have in their portfolio. They're going to have custom applications, they're going to have web, they're going to have mainframe, they'll have a whole variety of applications. In those organizations, when you look at large changes, so for example, in this one, change to an order process, right? This is very common. What we see is that that process doesn't sit within one particular application, it spans multiple applications. So in this, what we're really doing is we're kind of reflecting what does this look like? How does this all come together when we're doing this with SAP and custom? And in this process, we would have a major change, right? It's occurring in SAP. We're making changes, kind of following the traditional approach here. You know, you might be employing Agile techniques, but you're going through the typical configuration and build out of a process in SAP. You may have a front-end component to that, though, that sits in that lower left side where you have custom development, a new order UI, order process UI. So you may have your custom development teams who are going through their process of Agile, continuous integration. You have SAP going on above, building out the core of the process. At some point, all of that has to come together, and it really has to be really in the context of a release train. That release train may be just SAP, but in this case, it's going to span multiple applications. If you're going to have that release train that spans multiple applications, you have to ensure that the change you've introduced works across all of the applications, that process end to end. And that's really where you start to see the real benefit of Worksoft. We have that ability to create those tests that span applications, whether it's SAP, whether it's the GUI, whether it's Fiori, spanning web applications such as Salesforce. If it's a mainframe application, a custom web application, we have the ability to do automated testing, build that out in those end-to-end tests so that you can rapidly and iteratively test those so that you can ensure that you got the quality and you don't pose a risk to the business. So in terms of specifically how some of the products fit within that, right, one of them is Worksoft Impact. And Impact allows you to identify the transactions that are affected by changes that are contained in transports. And from that, we can generate test plans, we can also highlight where we have gaps in test coverage. So it's very easy to use and it's extensible, right? We have the ability to integrate this with other products. So again, if you have products that sit within that CI/CD DevOps portfolio, we have the ability to integrate with those. And then really core to all this is Execution Manager. And with Execution Manager, this is where we have the ability to schedule and run the regression tests at scale. So where we're able to set up those tests that will span an end-to-end process across multiple applications, different user interfaces, have the ability to set that up and do that very fast execution where we're able to determine or specify dependencies, where we can set this up to run on a scheduled basis. From that, we're able to really accelerate the automation. We're also able, with Execution Manager, to tie in with other products that you're probably familiar with in the CI/CD world. And if we look at this, so from just the pure SAP perspective, if we're looking at that, we've got, we're able to do that cross-platform automation using Certify and Execution Manager, and we're able to tie in with, mock services. We're able to use REST APIs. So that's just kind of looking within SAP itself, but when you look at spanning into the complete enterprise operations view, we also have the ability to integrate Execution Manager and Certify with applications such as Jira, or if we want to kick off execution of SAP tests, because we've done build on custom application and we're using Jenkins, we have the ability to call Execution Manager and kick off tests and Certify beginning from Jenkins. So it just gives you an idea of how we integrate with the other applications that enable that. So as I mentioned, if we're, this is just an example here of using Jenkins in the CI/CD world, being able to use a REST call to Execution Manager to kick off tests that would run on multiple physical or virtual machines running in parallel and setting up dependencies, having all that scheduled and running in Execution Manager. Okay, so in summary, really, as I said, Agile is here. It's something that we have to adapt for SAP. And when we look at the core components of it, right, Agile is built for really targeted at speed and getting requirements, functionality built out and into the user's hands, so that's very business driven, right, and getting that functionality to the user quickly. Obviously we want to be able to build on that, and with Execution Manager, Certify, and Analyze, we're able to get much greater quality. We're able to do that in a much faster time period because of the fact we're able to automate things like the discovery, being able to do activities in parallel, and being able to execute on a continuous basis. So finally, just kind of in conclusion, as I mentioned, we've got some customers with some, we have some case studies available. You can find these from our website. If you look at these really across the board, the significant thing about these is the reductions in timelines, the kinds of improvements that these companies are able to achieve in reducing timelines and improving quality through the use of the Worksoft products. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Mark.
All right, thank you, Mike. And now we're going to move into the portion of the webinar where we take your questions. And we also have with us Chris Kraus, who is Worksoft's Senior Director of Product Management, and he will also be taking your questions. So you can submit those at any time using the question feature, and we have quite a few that have already come in. So our first question, does Worksoft have an Agile project management solution for SAP?
So Worksoft itself is not a project management product. However, we are able to integrate with any number of applications. So if you have tools that you're using for CI, CD, Agile, we do have the ability to integrate with those.
Okay, our next question, do you work with HP ALM or any other ALM tools?
The answer to that is yes. We have integration with HP ALM. We also integrate with IBM's Rational Quality Manager as well as Solution Manager. And as a matter of fact, with Solution Manager 7.2, we have an even deeper level of integration now where we're able to, as I mentioned before, we're able to create blueprints in Solution Manager using the outputs from Analyze. We're also able to integrate and run, schedule and run tests from in Certify from Solution Manager.
Let's see, our next question. What is one of the actual risks of applying traditional Agile Scrum to an SAP project? Does it apply as well to small enhancements?
Very good question. Agile Scrum, if you're really trying to apply that to an SAP project, you really have to define kind of what's the level of granularity, what's the minimum required functionality that has to be put in place in order for it to actually provide the business value. So, you really can't do 1 to 2 week iterations in an SAP environment. I mean, you might deliver functionality, but it may just be a standalone component, and there may be numerous other pieces that have to go into production in order to actually make it all functional from a business perspective. For small enhancements, you might be able to do that. You might be able to do things in a much faster manner. If once you're in production and you're live, then absolutely you can look at using Agile to move things definitely more quickly into production. But again, you have to take the grain of functionality into consideration.
Okay, what strategies or advice do you have around SAP test data?
SAP test data. So that's always the fun question, and it's the thing that's often overlooked until the end. Everyone goes to test, and then they suddenly realize, whoops, we don't have any data. There are a number of different approaches on that. There are definitely dedicated test data tools, and you can use those products. We have abilities within Certify to create data. For example, if you're familiar with Certify, right, we're able to use record sets to run tests. So I could iterate through multiple different values to create, say, sales orders or production orders. If I wanted to, I could actually use Certify in that case to generate a whole set of production orders and have those then available to me to use as my test data. So that's an option there to use Certify as a component of a test data solution.
Okay, we had a question about the slides for the presentation, and as a reminder, we will be sending a copy of the recording out after the presentation, and we generally also make the slides available on SlideShare. Our next question, why do we need Jenkins when the same work is done by Execution Manager?
So this is Chris Kraus. So it's actually different. So Jenkins agents traditionally are used for CI, continuous integration. So you put agents on machines, you compile code, and then you can use Jenkins to kick off kind of continuous delivery tasks, whether it's, say, run your Puppet or your Chef scripts and that. But when we're testing an end-to-end business process, we need to make sure that the user's desktop is available. You can log into, say, Internet Explorer, you can log into SAP GUI, you can log into Chrome, maybe some test maps. And Jenkins isn't really well suited to activate a user's desktop and allow you to interact with the desktop. A lot of times, if you could get a desktop open, it could lock until you don't have accurate screenshots from that. So what Execution Manager's focus is to actually manage the environment around running the test to make sure the right Windows login occurred, so you have permissions to run the applications you're trying to test, and to make sure the screens don't lock. We have remote desktop context, so your screenshots and recordings of things work correctly. So yeah, Jenkins has agents to run things on remote machines, but it's usually more at a command line level, like running PowerShell scripts or Bean Shell scripts or, say, Python, not at activating desktops. So what we suggest is executions manager focus is to run tests in parallel, to handle desktop logins and users and accounts and all those things. Let us do that part and trigger it from your CI/CD platform.
We do have time for a few more questions, so if you have a question, you can submit that now using the question feature. Our next question, do you think that business users are prepared for Agile?
Probably not, but they're excited about it. I would say I get questions about, like, what is this Scrum thing, what is this Agile stuff from our customers probably 2 to 3 times a week. We've done some blogs on it, talking about it on our blog site in DZone. And the way I see it is 5 years ago, I was dealing with pure custom application development, a lot of mobile apps. So people started their journey in Agile then, trying to figure out how does the Agile journey work in the context of their organization, and they started building maturity to get continuous integration and constant source control, to continuous delivery, to getting things deployed and tested. And I think that business users at that point were very new and weren't sure about it. We're at that same point with ERP packages. The same place that, say, mobile and custom web apps were 5 years ago is where we're starting our journey with the apps. People are this year trying to understand, how does this change? How do I get my same levels of, like, quality assurance and my reporting for Sarbanes-Oxley, things like that, if I change my methodologies from a trusted and true, like, methodology I've been using with Waterfall and, say, ALM. So people are definitely asking, and they're trying to figure out how do they make Agile work for them, and they're starting their journeys. And I think over the next 2 years, we'll see a huge lift and people actually implementing it.
Okay. How do you support or integrate with Jira?
Quite well, thank you. What we do is we will let you take a result of a test. You can view it in Certify, and all you do is a right click, and we will go inject the defect in Jira, so developers are notified. They get a report of the test and all the data that went along with it. So it actually works quite nicely.
Do you consider Solution Manager the DevOps of SAP?
No, we consider it the ALM, Application Lifecycle Manager. So think of Solution Manager giving your ALM to be able to define requirements and tests and scope for Scrum. And then the DevOps platform, you know, the things that are moving the data. So yes, you can move transport, but the idea is, like, if you look at ADOP, which is a cartridge plug into Jenkins for moving SAP transports. So the ADOP methodology says, Jenkins asks SAP to move a transport. So it's not the core DevOps platform, it's a component of it that understands the nuances or specifics of SAP. So we think it's a great change management tool in SAP, great new Agile platform, but I wouldn't consider it a DevOps platform. It's a component of the bigger life cycle.
Okay, we have time for one more question. What is one of the most common misconceptions or mistakes of applying Agile in SAP, being an enterprise application compared to relatively smaller or non-integrated applications?
Oh, let's see. I think if I had to say what's the key component is, when you're doing SAP, you have to understand the implications of anything you do across an integrated environment, across an integrated application. So unless you have somebody who's an architect who understands that functionality, understands if I make change A to SAP, it's going to affect all of these various other functions or ways in which the business is going to operate. If you don't have that, that's really significant. And that's probably one of the biggest differentiators, is you have to have that really senior type of expertise and understanding of the entirety of the application.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Chris. And thank you to everyone for attending. If we weren't able to get to your question, we will be in touch with more information. As mentioned earlier, we will be sending a link to a recording of the webinar. And if you're interested in learning more about Worksoft, please visit our website. Thank you for your time today. This concludes the webinar. Have a great day.